Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Faring Jazz Bistro at the Harold and Dorothy Stewart Center for Jazz. We are Jazz St. Louis. Jazz St. Louis is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to advancing the uniquely American art of jazz. Please join us in thanking our seasoned sponsors, Wells Fargo Advisors, Worldwide Technology, and the Stewart Family Foundation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How's everybody doing tonight? What a treat, huh? To have one of the great legends of jazz here, Mr. Benny Golson. Man, I can't believe it. This has been a dream come true for us. So welcome. This is the very first of our Whitaker Jazz Speaks series, and we're very grateful to the Whitaker Foundation for making this series possible. They have made this. This is one of the events that we're doing. And in fact, next week we also have another event we have a book club event that's going to take place right in Nancy's Jazz Lounge next Tuesday night, featuring Maxine Gordon, who is going to be talking about her book, Sophisticated Giant, which is about her husband, Dexter Gordon. Not too bad, right? And then on Wednesday she's going to be down at the Schlafly branch of the St. Louis Public Library talking about the book as well. So we hope that if you enjoy this, we hope that you will come out and join us for that, because it's going to be a real special time, and it's really very important, I think, for us to remember the great legends who have made this music possible. Don't you think? So I'm very glad to have Benny Golson here. He is a storied musician. He is an NEA jazz master. He's brought us songs such as Killer Joe, I Remember Clifford, In Walked Betty, just to name a few. But his resume is vast, and he is truly a living legend. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to welcome to the stage the legendary, the great Benny Golson.
I wondered, was he talking about me? I heard all this great and everything, but whenever I go home, my wife tells me to put the trash out.
And I'm so glad that to have a conversation with him, we have a real treat in that we have somebody who is very distinguished. You may have seen him on Ken Burns documentaries such as Jazz, the Civil War, Baseball. He is, and I'm going to try to get this right, he is the Merrill Kling Professor of Modern Letters, of English, of African Studies, of African American Studies, of American Culture Studies, and the Director of the Center for Joint Projects in Humanities and Social Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Gerald Early. I think your title is longer than my whole biography.
Thank you, Gene. I want you to know that I held those, but I don't hold them all at once. So, I held them in some kind of sequence. But it's wonderful to be here with you this evening, and it's wonderful. I feel privileged, honored, in fact, to have the opportunity to have a conversation with Benny Golson. And I wanted to make a pitch for his book, Whisper Not, the autobiography of Benny Golson. It came out in 2016. It was published by Temple University Press. And for those of you who know about the Jazz Book Club, you will know that this was a book that we read in the Jazz Book Club. So for those of you who are in the Jazz Book Club and you are here tonight, you can also probably ask very informed questions because you read this book, as I have. It's a wonderful book, and if you have the opportunity, you should pick it up and read it. And it's one of the really very informative and very entertaining and engaging jazz autobiographies. So I'd like to start out by talking to you about your growing up in Philadelphia. You come from the city of brotherly love. When you were growing up, what made you want to go into music? You started out as a pianist before you became a saxophonist. Why were you interested in music as a child?
The neighborhood that I grew up in, it seemed like, as I can remember, everybody, or almost everybody, had a piano in the living room. But nobody really played the piano. They had doilies on it and pictures of the family and things like that, and they kept it polished, but nobody ever played it. But in my house, where I lived, it was different. My mother's brother and her brother-in-law, I thought they were fantastic piano players, but I was a kid, 7, 8, 9 years old. And I thought they were geniuses, but when I started taking lessons and began to know a little more about it, I discovered that they were god-awful. But anyway, that's what got me started. And when they would leave the piano, it was a mystery instrument. And I began to pick out little melodies, and my mother began to notice that, and then she asked me, "Would you like to take piano lessons?" And I never thought about it. And I said, "Yes." She says, "Well, I'll talk to the lady down the block because her son takes piano lessons, and I think he has a piano teacher. J. Walker Freeman." Oh, he wore those pinch-nose glasses. And when he'd get excited, they would shake, and I was always waiting for them to fall off. But that's how I began. And the lessons were pretty expensive. 75 cents a lesson. And he came to the house. Yeah, we're talking about ancient history now.
75 cents a lesson. This is back in the 30s.
You're right.
Yeah.
That's right. You're exactly right. Well, I'm giving my age away, but it doesn't matter.
Then you started out with the piano, but then you switched to the saxophone. You had a wonderful mother who obviously believed in your skills. Tell me about switching from the piano to the saxophone.
Well, it wasn't as smooth as you think it would be. I thought I was going to be a concert pianist. And I worked at it assiduously, from 9 until about 14. And somehow I began to hear from my friends about a fellow named Lionel Hampton, who was appearing at the Earl Theater that week. And one day I took off from school, and my mother didn't know about it, of course, to hear this band. I'd never seen a live band before. And when I came into the theater, the band hadn't started playing yet. And during those days, now we're going way back, and we're talking about live theaters, when the acts were not playing, they had an organist who played. And when the show was about to start, a spotlight would come fixed on the closed curtain, and whomever was the feature would begin playing with the curtain closed. This was all new to me. I didn't know what to expect. And then the curtain slowly opened, and in little increments I could see what was the saxophones. I didn't really know what they were. Then behind them were the trumpets and trombones. There was a drummer. There was a piano over here with the guitar. and Lionel Hampton had his set of vibes. Oh, it was another world for me. And they started playing, and then I noticed that while the music was going on, this fellow stepped out of the saxophone section, and I said, well, where is he going? He was coming to the front of the stage, and lo and behold, a microphone came up from out of the stage, and he started to play. And when he started to play, all of my piano dreams began to fade. I fell in love with that darn saxophone, and that's how it began. Now, we were on welfare. I knew I couldn't get a saxophone. So I began, after homework, I began listening to the radio intently. And my mother couldn't, what are you doing? I'm listening for the saxophone solos. That went on for a while. And then, she had hopes that when I really became good at playing, I would eventually replace Mrs. Conley, who was the church organist. Yeah. And I shot her dreams down because I told her, Mom, I don't think I want to play anymore the piano. Well, what are you going to do? I want to be a saxophone player. And she screamed, oh my God, you're going to be a dope addict. I had to convince her that dope wasn't on my mind. And I was hoping for a saxophone, the silver kind you saw hanging in the pawn shops, all beat up. And one day she came home, and she came home with a brand new saxophone. I couldn't believe it. I almost jumped out of my pants. And we walked into the house, because I saw her coming from the streetcar, and I was sitting on the steps, and she had this case, and she didn't leave home with that case. She only left with her lunch that morning. And I can't be. And then when she turned and walked across the street, I could see the length of it. I almost had a stroke. And when she got close enough to me where I could hear her voice, she leaned over as she was walking closer to me and said, I've got something for you, baby. I was going crazy. We came into the house, and she put the saxophone case on the couch there. And I opened the case and immediately became depressed. Now, when I saw Arnett Cobb flying home with Lionel Hampton, he was playing the saxophone. And the only way I could describe it, I didn't want the saxophone that went straight up to your mouth. I wanted the one with the curve in it. See, that was a tenor sax. But now, the horn, the main part was here, and the neck was over here, and then the mouthpiece was over. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't know how to put it together. And she said, well, the block where we used to live, Mrs. Mitchell's son plays the saxophone. Let's go there. So we went to Mrs. Mitchell's house, and Tony, he was a saxophone player, he showed me how to put it together. And then he said, play something. Well, I couldn't play anything. I didn't know how. So he put on a recording of Duke, I'll never forget it, Duke Ellington's Take the A Train. And he took my horn and started to play Ben Webster's solo. I was so proud. And then I realized, well, it wasn't me playing, it was him playing. Anyway, it was the summertime, and the record player, the old 78 records you might remember, which I wore out, was in the living room. Well, summertime, the windows were open, and I began to practice. It sounded like an animal being led to slaughter, and all the neighbors could hear me, and all the neighbors wanted to kill me. Yeah, it was pretty pitiful. But then I met a friend of mine, and we were both struggling, a fellow named John Coltrane. And he joined me in my living room, and they wanted to kill 2 people. Well, you had to start somewhere, and we were starting, and that's how it began.
Yeah. Yes, I'd like to take that up about John Coltrane because you were 16, I believe, and he was 18 when you guys met. And then you had the great epiphany when you saw Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie with you and John went to see him. This also was a big moment in your life. Could you say a little bit about that?
We were trying. John, he was playing alto saxophone at the time. He hadn't begun playing tenor yet, and he sounded just like Johnny Hodges, who played the alto with Duke Ellington. Beautiful alto sound he had. Oh, great! And I was trying to play like Arnett Cobb, who played with Lionel Hampton. That's the kind of music we were trying to play. And then Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker came on the scene. We didn't know what to make of that. And they came to town, and there was a live concert, and we were going to go see them, see what it was all about. We got a seat way up in the balcony where your nose bled if you got any higher. And they started to play. I never heard any music like that before. I'm used to hearing Lionel Hampton and Flying Home, and he's playing like Johnny Hodges. And Don Bias, a tenor player, he was there too. But Charlie Parker was so different. And during those days, sometimes at the end of a course, you would make a 2-bar break, start a new course. That break, you're playing by yourself for 2 bars, and you start a new course. Charlie Parker made a 4-bar break, playing double time. And when he did that, John and I never heard it. We were screaming like the Beatles. He was trying to climb up my body, and I was trying to climb up his body. And it's the one that we didn't fall over the balcony. We were screaming. I can't tell you words. I can't describe in words how we felt. And we had been playing stock arrangements when it came to Latin rhythms. My Shawl, Lady of Spain, just ordinary Latin things. But they played this song, and it had a Latin beat, but it was unlike any Latin music we had ever heard before. It was a night in Tunisia. We never heard anything like that. I'll tell you, when it was over, John and I, we rushed backstage. Slam Stewart was the bass player. Oh, who was a drummer? I can't remember. Al Haig was the piano player. Don Bias was there, yeah, and Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, yeah. So we're trying to get autographs. We're getting autographs from everybody. And Mr. Parker's about to leave the stage door because that concert was in the late afternoon, going into the evening. And that night, he was appearing at the Jazz Club, the Downbeat Club at 11th and Market, which was only a few blocks from the concert hall. And we were getting all these autographs, and he was getting away. So I said, John, Mr. Parker's leaving. So we caught up with him. And John said, can I carry your horn, Mr. Parker? And so he let him carry his horn. Now, John didn't talk much. I was always the talker. So I'm going to get at the bottom of this. How can this guy play all that stuff? So I began to ask him my series of dumb questions. What kind of horn do you play, Mr. Parker? What kind of mouthpiece do you use? What brand of reed do you use? What number reed do you use? I'm getting all the lowdown now because I want to sound like Charlie Parker, see. John and I used to talk every day. We didn't talk for a week. We were trying to digest this. And the phone rang one day, and he said to me, did you try that stuff Mr. Parker was talking about? I said, yeah. He said, did anything happen? I said, no. He said, me either. We thought if we got the horn and the reed and the mouthpiece, we would be able to play like Charlie Parker. Anyway, Charlie Parker was on his way to play at the club. Now, I had to go to school the next day, and it's getting late, you know. I didn't care what my parents were going to say. we got to the club and we had to give them the horn. We were too young to go in the club, and the club was on the second floor. But if we stayed down there, we could hear them playing. They played from 9 till 2, and we stayed there from 9 until 2. I didn't care about school. And on the way home, and when they finished, we were just as tired as they were from listening. And on the way, that was in South Philadelphia, and we both lived in North Philadelphia. And on the way home, we were dreaming, do you think one day we'd be able to play and sound like that and blah, 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 blah. And that's the way the dream started, trying to sound like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, never dreaming that one day I would be playing with Dizzy Gillespie, you know, and he would be playing with Dizzy Gillespie and other people. And things just began to accumulate. Because as time went by, we got better. But let me tell you, yeah, I skipped over this part. We got a call one day. We were playing in our living room, not for any people, and Jimmy Johnson called me. Jimmy Johnson had a 15-piece band, local band, and wanted to know, could I join his band? And he also called John. John and I joined Jimmy as Jimmy Johnson and his ambassadors, it was called. And being an ambassador, whenever we played, which was usually Friday or Saturday or Sunday on the weekend, which was great because I was in school, we had to play in a tuxedo, you know, with the bow tie and everything. Well, John and I didn't have a tuxedo, so every time we played, we had to rent a tuxedo. $4 for the evening. How much did the job pay? $8. So we went home with $4. We didn't care about the money. I eventually told my mother that, and she said, because I'm taking care of your butt. And we thought we were doing pretty good. And then we got a call. We had that job that Friday night, and we lived for those jobs. The music was corny, but now we'd come out of my living room and we're playing before people. And we didn't have 2 or 3 courses when you had a solo. Maybe you had 4 bars here, a couple of bars there. But we felt that we were moving ahead, making progress. We had this job Friday night. About 6:30, Jimmy sent his son by my house to tell me that this job that we had was canceled. Well, he went across town and told John the same thing. And then John came on over to my house, and we were sort of sad because even though the music wasn't that great, we felt that we were growing by being a part of all of this. And so we weren't even playing the records. We were just sitting in the living room, and my mother saw us. Now, I always thought my mother could have gotten a job with the FBI or the KGB, because she had what the people in the South call mother wit. You just feel things, you know certain things. And she asked us, why are you two sitting there looking so sad and not playing your music? And John said, oh, you know, Miss Golson, we had a job and it was canceled. And my mother went to work. What time did Jimmy send his son over here? Well, he came by here at 6:30. What time was the job? Well, the job was 8:30. And she thought, nobody cancels a job 2 hours before you begin playing. And she thought again. She said, I'll bet they're playing without you. And I can still hear John and all of his naivete. He said, oh, no, Mrs. Golson, they wouldn't do that. And my mother thought again, and she said, if it was me, I'd go up there where the job was canceled and see if they're playing. I looked at John, and he looked at me. Let's go. 21st and Columbia Avenue. It's about 8 blocks from my house. We got about a half a block from the American Legion Hall, and we heard this band play. John said, Benny, they're playing our music. I said, no, John, there are about 6 or 7 big bands here, and they all play the same corny music. We have to see who they are. So we went up the door where you get the tickets, and when the person came and the door opened, and then We could hear the band, but we couldn't see them because you had to go down the steps and across the dance floor, and they were set up against the wall. So the next person that came and got the tickets to the door, we fell on our stomachs. And it was Jimmy Johnson and his ambassadors. And somebody was in my seat, and somebody was in John's seat. Oh, our world came to an end. We went back to my house, and we stepped in. My mother said, "What happened?" John said, I can still hear him, "You're right, Miss Golson." And then we went into the living room where we always listened to the music, and we just stood in the middle of the floor. We were so hurt. I wanted to cry. And I know John wanted to cry, but we were too hip to cry in front of each other, you know. And my mother came over to both of us. She saw the pain that we were in, and she put her arms around both of us, and she said, "Don't worry, baby. One day the two of you will be so good that that band won't be able to afford you." But of course we didn't believe her. We just got kicked out. But things progressed. Yeah, progressed a lot.
And when you saw John Coltrane in Newport in 1957, you guys talked about how far you had come.
Yeah, we both wound up playing at Newport. Art Farmer and I formed a group called the Jazz Tet, and he had formed his quartet, and he was recording some vicious stuff, you know, and we were doing what we were doing. And we happened to be in the same dressing room, you know, trying to find a reed and tune your horn and whatnot. And all of a sudden, he took his horn out of his mouth, and he was laughing. He could, and I was saying, what? He said, "Remember what your mother told us, you know, about one day we'd be so good?" And he said to me, "Well, those guys are still in Philadelphia, and we're at Newport."
So you played as you were getting your jazz education, you played with Bull Moose Jackson, you played with Earl Bostic. And you talked about Earl Bostic as very...
That guy. Now, Charlie Parker was great, but this guy was a technician. He did things... Let me tell you this. He was playing once, and Charlie Parker was there listening. And Charlie Parker was listening with his mouth open. That Earl Bostic. Now, the style wasn't that, but the technique that guy had was unreal. I don't know if you remember Earl Bostic, because his claim to fame was a song called Flamingo. Now, he could do all that playing, but he played a simple song like Flamingo because that's how he was making his money. That made him famous. But he was one heck of an alto saxophone player. That guy, I'll never forget him. Technique. Charlie Parker, I don't think, could beat him with technique. With the style, oh yeah, it was something different. But I'll never forget Earl Bostic. Yeah, I played with Earl Bostic and Lionel Hampton. Yeah, that band that I came to see when that tenor player played, I was a part of Lionel Hampton's band. You know, and Lionel Hampton, non-academic, I don't think he could read music, but he had a heck of an ear. That guy, and he never wanted to stop playing. Whenever I played with him, the show was over and the curtains were closing, he kept playing. The curtains were closing, it was supposed to be over, and he's still playing. Years later, he dispensed with the big band, and he got a small seven-piece group together, and I got a call to play with him again, and I told my wife, it's going to be easy this time. The guy's old, you know, old. The years have caught up with him. He was worse. Worse, the whole band walked off. And we had to come back because he wouldn't stop playing. He was really something, but he could play. Somebody mentioned once about him being old and a relic of the past, and he said to the piano player, and he called everybody Gates. Gates, play that John Coltrane, Giant Steps. And the piano went into it. He played everything you could imagine on John Coltrane's Giant Steps. He was old, but he hadn't lost anything. That guy was phenomenal. I'll never forget him either.
And it was through joining Lionel Hampton that you met Quincy Jones.
Yes. 1953.
Mm-hmm.
I was playing in Atlantic City with a fellow named Tad Dameron, who was a great arranger. And in that band, let's see, was Clifford Brown, Philly Joe Jones, Jimmy Merritt, G.G. Grice, Benny Golson. I was there, yeah. I forgot the trombone player. I can't remember his name. But that was the band that we had, and boy, that was a learning experience. Tad Dameron from Cleveland. I'll never forget him either.
Was Quincy important?
Oh, I didn't finish telling you. Oh. So
Okay.
Lionel Hampton came to town, and Quincy and a couple of other musicians, we were playing the Paradise with the club, and they had a showgirls and a comedian and a tap dancer, that kind of thing. And they came to catch the show, and Quincy liked the way I played, and he liked the way G.G. Grice played, and he liked the way Clifford Brown played. Now, it was almost Labor Day when Atlantic City closed down during those days. That was the end of it. And Lionel Hampton needed some new musicians, and Quincy went back and told Lionel Hampton about us. And we got hired in Lionel Hampton's band after we finished Atlantic City. Yeah, that's how I met Quincy. And during those days, nobody knew who Quincy Jones was, just like they didn't know who Benny Golson was. And we've been friends ever since then. Yeah, Quincy Jones and I. Yeah, we're old guys now. As Curtis Fuller calls us, you old boogers.
Was Quincy particularly an influence or encouraged you in composing? Because of course that's what Quincy was known for and what he did.
No, we each had our own directions. But this guy was astute. Now, he was playing fourth trumpet. He wasn't much of a trumpet player, but he was a heck of a composer and arranger, yeah. And we used to compare notes all the time. I admired him and he admired me. And we weren't competing with one another. We were just friends doing the same type of things. And later, as a matter of fact, Quincy and I became roommates. So we really got to know each other. Yeah, he's still my buddy.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about some of your compositions. I'd like to start with Stablemates.
Oh my goodness.
And how John Coltrane helped you with that particular composition with Miles Davis.
He didn't help me with the composing, but he got
helped
it to
you,
Miles.
got Miles.
Do you want to know how Stablemates came? You're
Yeah.
not going to believe this
How
story.
did it come about?
It came about because I was involved in the middle of a divorce. And you want to know what I'm talking about? Okay. I decided that it was time to leave my wife. She didn't want the divorce, but I did. Now, I was playing with a fellow during that time named Earl Bostic, and we were playing in a town called Wilmington, Delaware, Clifford Brown's hometown. Well, it was 15 miles from her hometown, Chester, Pennsylvania. She decided she was going to come there because she knew I was playing with Earl Bostic and I would be there. And during those days, we played an hour, and people danced during that time. We took a half-hour break, and then we played a final hour. She wanted to talk to me during that half hour. She came with a couple of her girlfriends. I didn't want to talk to her. So I pretended that I had a commission that I had to fulfill and I was running behind. So when the intermission came, I didn't leave the bandstand. I stayed there with my piano and paper as though I was trying to finish. And I started putting some notes down. And that was the beginning of stablemates. But in my deception, I came up with something that was oddball. Instead of 16 bars, which were complete, or 12 bars, which would have been complete as a blues, I came up with 14 bars. And I said, this can't be. So the next town, I'm trying to make it into 12 bars. That didn't work, and I tried to add 2 more bars to it, and that didn't work. It seemed like the 14 bars worked. Well, let me leave that there and put an 8-bar bridge to it, and maybe I can come back to it later. So I put an 8-bar bridge to it, but I couldn't get rid of that darn 14 bars. So I called it that weird tune. Now, I had to give it a title. During those days, Earl Bostic and I used to play Boston a lot. And there was a fellow there called Herb Pomeroy, a trumpet player at the New England Conservatory. And I used to sit in with those guys because they played at a club called The Stables. Now, putting the title on it, it was sort of an honor or a tribute to them. So I just called it Stable Mates, because what happens in a stable? All the horses are there, and they're like a friendship, if you liken people to a stable. So it was my friendship with them, so that was the title, Stable Mates, or Friends or Friendship. All right, I didn't think much of it. I mean, I'm embarrassed when I think back to those days, because I would meet people and shake their hands and give them a tune. And did anything ever happen? Nothing. So John Coltrane left Philadelphia to join Miles Davis. And vicariously, we all left with him because we used to all play the jam sessions together. 2 weeks went by, and I saw him. We both lived in North Philadelphia. And so I said to him, how's it going with Miles? He says, it's going great, but he needs some tunes. Do you have any tunes? Did I have any tunes? So I thought about this oddball tune. Maybe it's just crazy enough he might like it, even with the 14 bars. So I gave it to John, and I didn't think any more about it because nobody ever recorded anything of mine. And about a month went by, and I saw him again. He didn't even say hello this time. He said, you know that tune you gave me? I said, yeah. He said, we recorded it. What? Miles recorded my tune? Yeah, he dug it. And when I saw Miles, Miles said to me, what were you smoking when you wrote that? Miles put me on the map as a jazz composer, and I owe my dear friend John Coltrane so much, who took the tune to him, and Miles who recorded it. That's what got me started. And when it came out, Stablemates, and underneath, Benny Golson. And all those lead sheets I'd passed out, I don't know what the people did with them. They saw Benny Golson, and they said, Benny Golson. They started looking for the lead sheets, and they started recording my stuff. Yeah, that's how that began.
Then there is Killer Joe, which you wrote with the Jazz Tet.
Yeah, that came a little later. But now, I was living in Philadelphia, you know. This is only 90 miles from New York. Mm-hmm. But in a certain way, it was 1,000,000 miles away from Philadelphia. But that was like Mecca. I decided I'm going to move to New York, where things are happening. And when I came to New York, I was green, young and green. Just joined Dizzy Gillespie's band, and we played Birdland a lot. And the way the bandstand was set up, you're looking out at the people this way, you could see the people as they entered. So as we're playing, we can watch the people coming in, you know. And I began to notice a certain thing about a certain kind of person. And these guys they were always black, but they came with coiffed hair, fingernails manicured, diamond rings, silk suits, expensive alligator shoes, their Cadillacs being parked by the attendant upstairs, beautiful woman in furs on the arm, sometimes a woman on each arm. They set up the bar. They paid with large bills. And the thing that confused me, none of these guys worked. I couldn't put that together for some reason or another. We went to Chicago. I saw some similar things. I saw it in Los Angeles. I saw it in Boston. I saw it in Philadelphia. We came back to New York, and it started all over again. Now, the alto player next to me, he was a little older. He had had some experience, and he saw I was befuddled. And he leaned over to me and said, "These girls, they work for them." And I said, "Oh, stenographers." I was a slow comer. Stenographers at 3 o'clock in the morning? They were pimps, of course. And during those days, if somebody sneezed, I would write a song about it. I had to write a song about this epiphany. So I started one morning, about 9, I had some ideas. And there were 2 chords that were predominant in my mind. Now, I wanted to get the full sound of those chords that would maybe edge me on to some kind of a melody to go with it. And so I couldn't play the chords fully and the melodies, so I played the 2 chords, and I'm thinking different melodies. Now, my wife was in the apartment with me, and it was wintertime, cold outside. From 9 in the morning to about 9 in the night, she was hearing these 2 chords. Now, she kept leaving the apartment, and I didn't quite know why, and I didn't know where she was going because snow on the ground outside. She didn't put a coat on, a scarf, gloves, no overshoot. But I was busy, and I didn't pick. But later I found out these 2 chords were wearing her down. And she had to leave. She was about to throw up, and she had to leave from time to time and come back. Well, when I finished the tune, and I had to give it a name, I wanted to make it a song of the streets. And it had to be a common name. And the name that first came to mind was Joe. It's a common name. Well, what kind of moniker would he have? Well, during those early days, I remember as a kid, there was prohibition. And whiskey was illegal. And this is when the bootleggers took over. And number writing and all that kind of thing. And it seemed like when all these illegalities, there was always somebody named Killer. Killer Johnson, Killer Williams. Maybe the Killer was to show that they were at the top of their game. I don't know. But my song became Killer Joe. Now, my wife was the closest one by. And when I finished it, I said, "Baby, what do you think of this song?" She was waiting 12 hours for me to ask her. And she told me, "It will never make it. It's too monotonous." And she added some choice words in there. But I was playing with Art Farmer at the time. We had a group, the Jazz Tet. I recorded it anyway. The disc jockey started to play it. When we played the clubs, the people who came to hear us play were requesting it. People started to buy the records. The royalties started to come in. My wife bought one fur coat, She bought two. Later, she bought a third. She loved Killer Joe.
I'd like to have you talk a little bit about when you were in Dizzy Gillespie's band. There was a young trumpeter from Philadelphia named Lee Morgan, who was also in the band. And I remember that as a teenager, I first encountered your name on a Lee Morgan album. It was called City Lights. And you wrote most of the tunes. You had arranged the album. And I said, who's Benny Golson? And so could you talk a little bit about Lee? Because you were really, you had some involvement with Lee Morgan. Could you talk a little bit about him?
Lee Morgan was a talented fellow. I never remember ever hearing him practice. And when he was in the band, during those days, there were two musicians to the room. Things were expensive. And he was my roommate. Yeah. Quincy Jones used to be my roommate. When Quincy left the band, Lee Morgan took his place, and Lee was my roommate. And I never remember him practicing. And it was amazing because Lee Morgan had large lips. And when he played, he tucked his lips inside some kind of way, and he was able to play. And he used to laugh and say, I think I'm the only person that can play the trumpet with the tuba mouthpiece. Yeah, but he could play. And he was creative, he was inventive. And he was a he was a practical joker. You never knew what was gonna happen when he was around. Never. You'd go to sleep on the bus and you'd wake up with a hot foot, But I loved that guy. And Alfred Lyon on Blue Note Records heard about him and wanted to record him. Now, people were writing music for the recordings. I didn't know what the procedure was. And when he engaged me to do it, I gave him a price. Alfred Lyon, Blue Note. He never paid anybody. He thought I was crazy because I was asking for money for the stuff that I was going to write and write for the group. So I was the first one that he ever paid. And that first album was City Lights. And Lee was the first one to ever record I Remember Clifford. Yeah, he was the first. Dizzy was the second, and the third was a fellow named Donald Byrd. And then after that, everybody started recording I Remember Clifford. I found out that they played it at weddings. They played it at funerals. I don't think they ever played it at divorces. But I remember I went to Japan with Ron Carter, about 10 years or so ago. And those Japanese are something. And one of them walked up to me and said, Mr. Golson, do you know how many recordings there are on I Remember Clifford? I had no idea. And he told me over 200. About a year passed, and somebody asked me the same question in New York. And there were over 400 recordings on I Remember Clifford. This past year, there are over 500 recordings on I Remember Clifford. All kinds of groups recorded. Incredible. Yeah. You never know. You never know. And people think that Benny Golson is some sort of a genius. He writes all of these tunes that everybody records. When I wrote those tunes, Stablemates, I Remember Clifford, Out of the Past, this or that, I didn't know what the heck was going to happen. Time tells you what happens when people start requesting the tunes and recording the tunes and paying for a copy of the tunes. That's when you know. If I'd known before that, I wake up in the morning, I think I'll write a hit tune today. But it doesn't happen like that. We never know. And you'll never know all the dogs that I wrote that never made it, the Maharaja and the Blues. I'm finger popping and hip shaking. Yeah. You don't want to hear those tunes. No, I'm not a genius.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the transition you made from being this successful jazz musician and jazz composer to going into film and television and composing in Hollywood. First of all, why did you want to make that change and leave a successful career and become a film and television composer?
My buddy went out there first, Quincy Jones, and he kept saying, Benny, you got to come to Hollywood. Well, I eventually did, but I didn't know anything about what was going on. But there was a fellow that I began to study with, Henry Brandt. That guy was an orchestrator. Henry Brandt is the one that orchestrated, you remember a picture called Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor? He's the one that orchestrated the music. Kings Go Forth, some great pictures he did, and he was my teacher. He was teaching at a college called Bennett College up in the north, and he used to come home on the weekend, and every Sunday I had a lesson with him, with Henry Brandt, a private lesson with him. And I did that for a couple of years, and I learned a lot from him. Then I did go to Hollywood, and my friend Quincy got me started because he was with Peter Faith. You remember Peter Faith's father, Percy Faith, who was recording with large orchestras, and he was an agent for composers, and he put me with him. And I got my first shot at Universal Pictures, Robert Wagner, It Takes a Thief. I think that was the first thing I did. And then later other things came up, Mission Impossible, MASH, and...
You did MASH for 3 years.
I did MASH for 3 years, yeah. That's when I met Alan Alda. Quite a guy, just ordinary like us. I could call him at his mother's house in Jersey, yeah. Just an ordinary guy, just famous, that's all, but nothing to prove. And Mickey Rooney, if you remember Mickey Rooney, yeah, Mickey Rooney became a good friend, and I met him through Benny Carter. Benny Carter used to do music when he would do his Las Vegas acts, and Benny was busy and couldn't do it, and introduced him to me. Then I started doing music for his Las Vegas acts, and that's how I came to know him. And he used to talk about Judy Garland all the time. Yeah, he was a good friend. And things happen like that, you know. Nothing planned, but you just happen to be at the right place at the right time. Yeah, incredible.
You said in your book, in your autobiography, that in some ways you found film composing to have more freedom than doing jazz.
Oh, let me tell you. To prove the point that you just said, I don't remember what show I was doing, but it was dramatic music. And I took my tune, Stablemates, and I changed it around, changed the meters, and nobody in the orchestra knew it, but one guy in the orchestra, he was a jazz musician when he wasn't in the studio. He knew it was Stablemates, and when we finished playing, he was laughing. Nobody else knew it. You have that kind of freedom. You can do all kinds of things. And that kind of writing is different than getting up on the stage and playing the blues or Take the A Train. Pandiatonic writing, and you won't understand what that is, where all the notes are right if you just concentrate on the white keys on the piano. And you make up your own chords by determining what group of notes you're going to use. Pandiatonic writing, serial writing, you're free to do anything you want if it works. Now, if you do something that doesn't work, you're in trouble. Yeah. So that was a challenge, too, to do that. But that became a chore because you were like a doctor on call all the time. And I was working a lot for Universal Studios. And I would get a telephone. I'd get up early in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, and I would write from 6 o'clock in the morning to 12 midnight, writing. And you'd get calls during the day. Benny, do you have Reel 3 ready yet? Well, it's not ready yet. Don't send the message over yet. Wait a little while. And then I remember one morning I got up. I couldn't think of anything to write. And the telephone rang. Do you have Reel 2 ready yet? Not yet. And I'm looking at the empty page. And I thought, so this is how it ends. Because they don't want to hear that you don't have the music ready. They don't even talk about that. Yeah, those kinds of things. And my wife and my daughter, they're going out to the beach, to Santa Monica Beach, and I'm in there like a humpback man writing the music all day long. Yeah, and after a while you get a little tired of that. And then the disloyalty that you get from the studio sometimes, the different things that happen, the different things I saw. Now, when you was writing for television, that take is good enough. But now when you're doing a feature film, it's got to be just so. And I did both of that. Now, I did mostly television writing for the different shows. But that was a trip, yeah. My time wasn't my own. I enjoyed the writing, but after about 12 years, you feel like a prisoner sometimes. You can't go anywhere, you can't do anything, and you dare not make a mistake. You know, the timing has to be right. The music has to be right on the point. When he stomps his foot, the music has got to be right there. And if it's not there, you've got 50, 60, 75 musicians. You've got to change it on the spot. And sometimes that's difficult to do, to make it jive with what's going on the screen. And then you've got the streamers that's telling you what happens. You see the things going across like that. They make the mark on the film, and it transposes to a mark going, and you can determine how fast or slow it's going. And when it gets to the right, whatever's supposed to happen, it's supposed to happen. And if it doesn't happen, you've got some changing to do. So that kind of pressure is on you like that too, you know. And while you're doing all of this, couple of the big wigs are sitting back there with the book and the script and all of that while you're doing all of that. And if anything goes wrong, you got to answer. Yeah, those kinds of things. The music is great, but that kind of pressure adds to what you're doing. So sometimes it would take some of the joy away because of the bureaucracy, you know. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But we're free to do whatever we want, as long as it works.
And you had a chance to work with Steven Spielberg, and you made a cameo appearance in one of his films.
that was strange how that happened. The office called me. I was in New York, and my office was out in L.A. They said, Steven Spielberg called and wants to know if you're interested in being in, not music for it, being in the film. And I told my office, no. And you know why I told them no? Because many times I'd gotten a call to be in commercials that you see. But when you get there to try out for the commercials, it's like a cattle call. There's 50 people for the same part that I never got called for anything. So I figured it was one of those things, whatever it was, I was going to be there, and 10 or 12 other guys. And when I told them that, and they were surprised when I said no, and I told them why, and they said, no, he wants you. I said, really? And so I found out what it was all about. And what he did, he sent me a script and what he wanted me to say. Now, I didn't know what the film was about, but the film was about me, and he never told me that. And so eventually I asked him, why did he do this film about me? And Tom Hanks was the guy that was trying to get my autograph. Why did that come about? He said, when I was in college, I used to come and see you play. That was Steven Spielberg, and he was a jazz fan. And while we were recording, doing this, during one of the breaks, Tom walked over to me and said, Benny, you don't know what a pleasure it is for me to be doing this film with you. Tom Hanks. A pleasure to be doing this with me. I'm with him. But that's how we all became friends, yeah. We email each other right and left. Stephen is so busy that I don't write him as many emails as I do Tom, but Tom, as soon as I write him, he answers me back. And then I met him in New York because his wife is a singer, Rita. And we had dinner, and we went to hear her sing, and it was quite an evening. Rita, and the first time, I'd never seen her before, but she was reading the emails that I sent him, and she came over and gave me a big hug and kiss. And she's just like him, nothing to prove, just ordinary. And Tom, just ordinary. If he were to come in here and you didn't know who he was, he's just an ordinary person. But that guy is talented. Ooh. I think he's the highest paid one in Hollywood these days. Yeah. And he's my dear friend.
The film is Terminal, which stars Tom Hanks. And Tom Hanks' character wants Benny Golson's autograph because he is one of only 2 surviving people from the famous photograph that was taken in Harlem in 1958 of 57 jazz musicians for front of this brownstone in Harlem. And Benny Golson and Sonny Rollins are the 2 living jazz musicians from that very famous photograph. And that's why Benny Golson is in the film, because he's part of the story of the film. Did you like the film?
It was great. I enjoyed it more.
And being out playing now, how do you feel about what's happening with jazz now and young players out there now? What's going on with the music now?
Well, hip hop is really not my thing, but at the same time, I say, why not? They should have an opportunity to do what they feel and what they want to create, just like I do with what I feel. I might not like it, it might not be my cup of tea, but they should have the privilege of doing it. There should be no bars or wires around them to prevent them from doing it. So I say yes, everything else changes. Architecture changes, the cars we drive change, we change. I used to have hair. Everything changes. Yeah.
Are there any younger musicians on the scene right now that you particularly like or interest you?
Some of them I don't even know the names. There's a fellow in Michigan, I forgot the city, but that guy's like another Art Blakey, and nobody's ever heard of him. Then I've heard people where I sit in sometimes, well, I don't sit in much anymore, but people play, and I give a lot of master classes, and sometimes the teacher, he teaches all the time, but sometimes the teacher learns, believe it or not. These youngsters, they have things on their mind. They're opening doors that maybe I never thought about opening. So I listen to them because sometimes they have something to say and something that I can use. Yeah, music changes like everything else. And some of it we might consider bad, but what we consider bad, somebody else might love it. So that's the way it goes. Yeah. And I'm privileged to be a part of all of this. You know, I'm glad I chose music. Suppose I had chosen basketball or football. Has anybody ever heard of a 90-year-old quarterback? See, I'm 90 years old and still going with this music. Yeah, it's a privilege and I love it. I love it. Yeah. And I tell you what else I love. People who come and support it, like these people here. Can you imagine what I would do if I came in here and nobody was in here? I'd wind up playing my saxophone in my bathroom for the rest of my life. But I don't have to because you're here supporting me in this music we lovingly call jazz. I love it and I love you.
At the end of your autobiography, you talk a bit about your religious faith, I was wondering how much of a role your religious faith has played in your career, in your music, in your creating of your music.
Well, it's not involved in my music, but it's involved in my life. Yes, I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses. And there are some people that hate us when we knock on their doors Saturday mornings and wake them up. But they don't understand. And I can understand that. When you don't have knowledge about a certain thing, you don't have it. So I don't put them down for hating us. I just hope that some of them will come to understand what we're all about. Like all of us, whatever we believe. We believe in it and we live it. And we'd like for people to understand it. When I first started out, it's interesting, nobody's ever asked me this, what you ask me now. When I first started out, I was about 15 years old, a rank amateur, and I had two friends, and both of them were white. One was a white American, Don Rappaport, and the other was Jules Greenberg, a Jewish kid. We were all about 15 years old. And we formed a group, piano, drums, and saxophone, and we called ourselves the Hot Spots. And our first gig was in Jules' synagogue. And I began to play bar mitzvahs and all the Jewish gatherings, and I was the only black one there. But they treated me almost like I was Jewish. That's the way my career began. Yeah, incredible. A few years ago, Don died. He was a brain. He taught, I forgot what university, but he was a brain. I think about 10 years ago he died. But Jules and I, we were both 90 years old. He's still married to Joan. He lives in Los Angeles. He used to be, if you watch television, I'm sure you do, many of the shows that you watched, he was a musician on lots of those shows. And the last time I saw Jules, a couple of years ago when I played Los Angeles, he showed up and brought the head of the department of the show that he was, I don't remember the show, Marionettes or something, I forget what that show was, whatever it was. And we're still friends, dear friends, and we go back 75 years. Jules Greenberg, my buddy.
Do you still have any connections with Philadelphia? Do you go back to Philadelphia at all?
You know, when you get as old as I am, your classmates are gone, family is gone. When I do go, and I don't go much, my family is gone. I don't even ask, how is so-and-so? Because I'm afraid I'm going to get that answer, oh, he's no longer with us. And that happens over a period of time. And I know it happens, but I never saw it coming. You know, and I used to say, I'm getting old. You know, that present continuous, that ing, getting. Cancel that out now. I am old. An old booger, as Curtis Fuller calls me. Yeah, but I'm enjoying it. I didn't know I was going to get this far. But as a kid, my Uncle Dewey was 39 years old, and I remember thinking, wow, he's an old guy. Yeah, I'm enjoying it.
Well, I've just gotten a signal from our sponsors that we, as Rocky the Flying Squirrel would say, Hokey Smokes Bullwinkle, we have run out of time. But I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. It's been wonderful to hear Benny Golson. Please have another round of applause for Benny Golson.
Thank you.
Once again, how about a big round of applause for our moderator here, Dr. Gerald Early. And one of the wonderful things about this evening is that we're now going to get a chance to hear Benny and his band. So we're going to give him a little bit of a chance to get set up, and then we're going to hear some selections from Benny Golson's quartet. ladies and gentlemen. So we've heard from the man himself. Once again, I want to take a moment to thank the folks that made this possible. How about it for the Whitaker Foundation, who made this sponsors of our Jazz Speak series. Thing is, this is a dream. If you are a jazz musician, this is a dream come true. To hear this wonderful conversation, to hear about somebody talking to John Coltrane before he was John Coltrane, right? And hear Benny Golson talking about himself before he was Benny Golson. What a treat. But now, oh man, now we get to hear the man. So ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together and welcome to the stage, Benny Golson.
My wife says I talk too much, but she's not here. We'd like to begin with a tune that has meaning to it. I think about Sonny Rollins. We met in the airport once in Paris, and he said, "Benny, this music we play, there's no end to it." And I thought about that. He's right. Later, I ran into the late Hank Jones, and he put it another way. He said, "Benny, this music we play, it's like the horizon is ahead." Now, that was pretty philosophical. What did he mean by that? Well, what happens with the horizon? Nobody ever says, "Well, here we are at the horizon." There is no such thing. And that's the way we pursue this music that we love. There's no end to it. We're always trying to best ourselves and come up with extrapolations and this and that. And all of that is to introduce our first song, the title of which is Horizon Ahead. See, you get used to doing things. I'm sorry. That's not what I told the group we were going to play. Oh, I forgot. You know, when I was coming up in Philadelphia, the old timers used to tell us youngsters to do this and don't do that. They would give us advice, you know. Until one day, one of them said to me, "Now, son, when you play, make it look difficult." And I said, "Why?" "Because if you make it look difficult, your audience will appreciate it more." Oh, here it is. You know, recently I was in Poland, and it brought back memories of an older trip that I made there years ago. And when I first went to Poland, there was an accordion player there. He wasn't that good. He was all right, but later this guy came to the States. And the next thing I knew, he had a program every Saturday playing to 10 million people. And his show always began with a close-up on a glass of champagne with the bubbles rising to the top. Yeah, it was Lawrence Welk. Now, fortunately, he left the accordion behind. But he had a very famous show. And I never watched it. It wasn't my kind of music. I thought it was kind of corny. But my wife's grandmother, she was there every Saturday. And I thought Lawrence, he was making money and it was okay, but the music was, But then I thought, you know, maybe I'm not being honest with Lawrence. I decided that one Saturday, I'm going to listen to his program. And I didn't know that I'd picked a Saturday when old Lawrence was going to be hip hip Lawrence Welk. And what made him hip was the material that he was going to play. You know? He was going to play Duke Ellington's theme song, Take the A Train. Everybody knows that. But now in his hipness, and we're going to play it for you now too, Take the A Train. But in his hipness, notice the way he introduced it to 10 million people. He said, ladies and gentlemen, no musical show would be complete without a song by the famous Duke Ellington. And we're going to play his theme song for you at this moment. Take a Train. You know, there's always a show-off in the group. This time it was our drummer. Great stuff, though. You know, I'm from Philadelphia, and we used to have jam sessions every Saturday from 4 in the afternoon till 7. And most of the clubs were in North Philadelphia. I remember the Cafe Society, the Ridge Point, the Zanzibar, the 3 Points. Oh, yeah. And the clubs were usually small, and the musicians would file in for the jam session, and there were more musicians than customers. And one Saturday, we got a surprise. While the jam session was going on, a stranger, he wasn't one of us because we knew each other, a stranger walked in and he had a trumpet under his arm. And while the tune was going on, he pulled his trumpet out and he started to play. And you know what? He sounded better than we did. So who was this guy? Who was this guy? Well, when the tune was over and the session was over, we found out the name of this guy. It was a fellow named Clifford Brown. He had come 30 miles from Wilmington, Delaware, to join us in our jam session. And join he did. Well, he wasn't able to come every week. Every now and then he would show up. And we were all amateurs, 16, 17, 18. But we knew that whenever Clifford joined a group, it was going to be a smoking group because of the way he played. And you know, you lose contact with people, whatever happened to so-and-so. And he turned up in New York a couple of years later, and it was a recording session that he was involved with. And that recording session was Friday Night at Berlin. I think that was the title of it. And it was an all-star group. Let's see, who was in that group? Clifford Brown, of course. Horace Silver was on piano. Art Blakey was the drummer. Hank Mobley, tenor. Lou Donaldson, alto. Curly Russell, bass. Yeah, I think that was the group. Now, there was a drummer in Brooklyn who had heard about Clifford. Now, this was his opportunity to see him and hear him. And he came to one of those sessions because they were recording every night. And he came to one of those sessions and he heard Clifford and he fell in love with him. And that drummer's name was Max Roach. He loved him so much that eventually he and Clifford Brown formed a quintet. Harold Land they got from San Diego, California as the tenor player. George Morrow was the bass player. Don't know where he was from. And Richard Powell. Richard Powell was Bud Powell's brother, and they both were from Philadelphia. That was the quintet. Now, they didn't have a record contract, but by word of mouth, they became very popular. So popular that a record company, and I don't remember which one it was, they heard about them and signed them to a contract. Now, they started to record as a quintet. Now, everybody was hearing them all over the world because that's where the records went, here, there, everywhere. Now, they had a big date coming up in Chicago. Now, there are lots of Blue Notes now, but there were only a couple of Blue Notes then, and it was the biggest Blue Note that was located in Chicago. But as it turned out, Harold Land's father had fallen ill, and he had to leave the group at that crucial time and go back to San Diego. Well, they got a substitute. They got some guy from Brooklyn. What was that guy's name? Sonny Rollins, yeah. Sonny Rollins became the sub. Now, during those days, we musicians didn't fly here and fly there. It was either the bus or train or somebody's car. I rode in so many cars. I knew the name of every car on the market. Max Roach had a car, and he figured, well, we have a few days free before we open, so let's leave early. So Max left with Sonny Rollins and George Morrow. They were going to drive to Chicago. Now, Richard, the piano player, had just gotten married, and he wanted to stay around Philadelphia as long as possible. Now, Clifford Brown had just bought a brand new 1955 two-tone green Buick. And the reason I remember it is because he gave me a ride in it. Yeah, that was nice. And he told Richard, well, look, if you want to stay around and we'll go the last minute, I can drive my car and we can all go together, you and your wife, and we can go to Chicago. And so they did. They left the last minute, the day before the opening. But now, and nobody called him Clifford in those days, I have to tell you. He was just Brownie. So Brownie was rather sleepy. He said, look, I'm going to take a nap on the back seat. Richard, you or your wife drive. Well, Richard said, well, I'm kind of beat too. So he said to his wife, well, sweetheart, why don't you go ahead and drive? There's not much traffic, and traffic moves kind of fast, and we'll just catch up on our nap here. And she started to drive on the way to Chicago. Now, the problem was it was raining torrential rain, cats and dogs, as they say. She wasn't a fantastic driver, but she could drive. But the rain was such a downpour that as she was about to pass one of those 18-wheelers, the road made an abrupt right turn, and the spray from the back wheels of the tractor and trailer overpowered the windshield wipers so that she couldn't see clearly, and she didn't see the turn. The truck made the turn. She kept straight ahead, off the highway, crossed the territory into the bottom of a bridge. You know, all three of them were killed instantly. Clifford Brown, Richard Powell, and his bride. Well, I was working in New York at the time with Dizzy Gillespie. We were playing at the Apollo Theater uptown in Harlem. And during the intermission, we were standing at the back of the theater on 126th Street when we saw, who was our piano player during that time? No, it wasn't Wynton Kelly. I forgot who it was. Walter Davis Jr. And we saw him come from the bar because that's where everybody went during the break. And we noticed that Walter was walking unsteadily and waving his hands and saying something that we didn't understand. And we laughed. We thought Walter had been with the wine just a bit too long. Because sometimes that used to happen. But we could always cover, when we were 15 musicians, you could cover for one guy that was a little under the weather. But when he got close, we heard the chilling words that Clifford Brown had been killed. We couldn't believe it. You know, you heard rumors like that Charlie died, and the next day you saw Charlie on the street. Charlie, I thought you were dead. Ron Carter told me he died twice. You know, they got things all mixed up. But anyway, the bell rang, and it was time for us to take our positions. And I'll tell you, with great incertitude, we didn't know whether Clifford was dead or not during that time. We opened with a flag waver, something fast and loud, psychological ploy to get the audience into the mood. But as we were playing this fast, happy-sounding music, you know what? A lot of us had tears coming out of our eyes because we loved Clifford. And we were hoping it wasn't true. But after the show, yeah, it was true. It was all on the news, television, radio. We were all so downhearted that Clifford Brown had lost his life, and of course, Richard and his wife. But we finished our engagement at the Apollo Theater, and our next engagement was a club in Los Angeles. Now, we had 2 weeks there at that club, and I was writing a lot of tunes during those days, and I thought, since I have 2 weeks, maybe I could write a tune about Clifford Brown. And so I set out to do it. Oh, I used to write 2 or 3 tunes a day. They were all not great, obviously, but this tune was something special. I wanted every note, I wanted every interval to be Clifford Brown, because I knew Clifford that well. We all knew him that well. And it took me almost a whole 2 weeks to write the song. I came early to work one night and brought my uniform because I knew I wouldn't be going back to the hotel, and Dizzy happened to come in early. Now I had a captive audience, and I said, Dizzy, do you have a moment? I'd like to play something that I'm writing in memory of Clifford. And he said, sure. He put his trumpet down on the table. There was nobody in the club other than the bartender, like you see in the movies, washing the glasses. So he put his trumpet down and he sat down, and I began to play this song that I was putting together. It was just about finished. And he opened his trumpet case and he took his trumpet out, and I'm thinking, wow, he digs the tune so much he's going to try to play it and he doesn't even know it. But he fooled me. He also took out a plastic flask of kerosene that he used to lubricate his valves. And while I was playing my heart out, that's what he was doing, lubricating his valves. And I said, oh, he's not even listening. And then to add insult to injury, he poured some down the bell of the horn and blew into it. And the kerosene got all over me and the piano. Oh, my goodness. And I finished. He put his trumpet down and said, Benny, that's beautiful. What? What is it? I said, Diz, I don't have a title for it yet, but I'm thinking about calling it maybe I Remember Clifford. Then I got the surprise of my life. This guy didn't know that I was in high school. I used to keep his photograph right on the wall at the foot of my bed so that every morning I woke up, I would look at Dizzy Gillespie and dream my impossible dream. Maybe one day I'd be able to play with the likes of Dizzy Gillespie. And here I'm playing with Dizzy Gillespie, and my hero comes down off of the wall and asks me, can he record my tune? I Remember Clifford, Dizzy Gillespie. I couldn't believe it. But you know what? We had another young trumpet player that had taken the place of Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones used to play fourth trumpet with Dizzy. He was only 18 years old, and his name was Lee Morgan. Lee Morgan was the first to record I Remember Clifford, followed by Dizzy Gillespie and a fellow named Donald Byrd. My goodness. I found out that the song was played at weddings, Funerals, no divorces though. I was entering a club in Copenhagen once, and on my way in, this fellow, a musician, it turns out that his wife had just died 2 weeks before we appeared there, and he was quickly telling me that she died, and in memories of her, during the funeral, they played I Remember Clifford, and they went into great detail, and we both stood out in front of the club crying. That was an experience. Anyway, we're going to play I Remember Clifford now. And I've played this tune myriad times, but every time I play it, I always wonder what would have happened had Clifford Brown not been killed. We can only imagine by the things that he left behind. So now, I Remember Clifford. See what happens when you don't expect it. Yeah, I'm gonna play it. Thank you so much.